Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Bridging Minds FSU ASUE Podcast Series on Armenian Entrepreneurship, where we spotlight innovation, resilience, and entrepreneurship across borders. I'm your host, Madison Miller, a research assistant at Florida State University's Jim Moran College of Entrepreneurship, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this initiative in order to amplify the voices of changemakers who are transforming ideas into impactful solutions. This podcast is made possible through the grant promoting STEM and social entrepreneurship through American and Armenian higher education collaboration from the United States Department of State. I also would like to highlight that the opinions, findings, and conclusions stated herein are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the United States Department of State. Today, I'm joined by Irina Ghaplanyan, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the World Bank and published author. We're going to dive into her journey, challenges that she's overcome, and the impact that she's making on others through innovation and purpose. Irina, I'm so excited to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, I just want you to tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got to where you are today.
Thank you. Well, I am Armenian. I was born and raised in Yerevan, Armenia, back in the beautiful and exhilarating 1980s. And at the turn of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reorder of the world order as we know it, I grew up in Yerevan, and very early in the 1990s, American government started introducing this fascinating program called FSA Flex, through which high school students had an opportunity to travel to the United States and study at a high school. So I took my chances, I did the exams, and I got in. I was an early starter at the school. I went to school at the age of 5 with a 10-year program, meaning I was going to graduate at 15. So when I landed in the States, in a small town of York in Pennsylvania, I was placed in the senior class at the age of 14. It was a roller coaster. It was a cultural, emotional, and in many respects, a personal roller coaster for me, leaving Armenia behind in far 1998 and traveling to the United States, kind of confronting two different worlds. And I feel that back then it shaped me a lot. Being a teenager, just at the cusp of my adulthood, having that kind of challenge of leaving your home and your family behind and living in the United States for 1 year. It largely also shaped my accent. A lot of people think that I'm a diasporan American, but no, I was born and raised and lived most of my life in Armenia. I find that program and additionally other programs of the U.S. State Department some of the most effective and powerful programs, largely projecting soft power of the American culture, American world order. And I'm happy to see that it continues to flourish and thrive. And we have a very strong alumni of these programs in Armenia. When I returned, I did 2 years of law school, then understood that Armenia is kind of straining my world horizon because I already had the taste of being out in the world when I was very young, and I felt like I needed to pursue my higher education outside of Armenia. And in higher education, the reforms were very slow to happen in the country. So I started applying abroad, and I got into a beautiful island of Malta in 1999, 2000. And I left Armenia to study international relations at the University of Malta. Malta is a fascinating island. It's just, it's a agglomeration of Mediterranean cultures. Being former British colony, it also had strong influence of the UK, strong influence of Italian culture, being only 90 miles away from Sicily. Anyway, it's a fascinating island and a small island state in the middle of Mediterranean. I enjoyed living there for 3 years. I studied international relations. And then after that, I pursued my master's at the Diplomatic Academy of London. It was a great program. We studied for 1 year. And after doing IR, I realized that I wanted to get a lot more practical knowledge, which the London Diplomatic Academy, which was part of the Westminster University in London, gave ample opportunities off as retired and current ambassadors at the time were teaching us. I then pursued 2 years of work. I got a very interesting position back in Yerevan. I was working on National Sustainable Development Council in Armenia. as part of the UNDP program at the time. Then I went to Berlin. I worked there shortly as a research fellow at one of the think tanks in Berlin. It's another fascinating part of the world. Berlin is very multicultural, very dynamic, but it still carries the scars of the Berlin Wall and what had happened back in the 20th century, the rift that occurred on the European continent. So these layers are very fascinating, and it's only living through your life on a daily basis in Germany do you feel this fascinating history of the country. I loved working for think tanks, and eventually I ended up landing another interesting position at a number of think tanks and research institutions in Washington, D.C. At the time, also, my personal life led me there. I met my future husband back then in Malta. He's a former Marine. He was on a Marine duty station there. And then he moved to D.C. and I moved to D.C. We married, and I stayed in D.C., worked for Georgetown University. And after we had our first child, I decided that, I want to go back to academia. And this is when I did my PhD. And I applied to a number of universities and then eventually decided that Cambridge is where I want to be. So I traveled to the UK, back to the UK again. And I was doing my doctoral studies in political science. And the interesting journey of how I pursued social entrepreneurship maybe happened earlier as well, because I was very proactive back during my student years, specifically engaging with human rights issues, with sustainability issues. And then the period when I worked at the UNDP, I realized the importance of coherence of the agendas of human development and sustainable development. So for me, gradually, as a political scientist, sustainability became part and parcel of what I wanted to self-educate myself with. And I also selected a number of courses that helped me understand the trajectory of how we as humans interacted with our ecosystems throughout history. So in the course of my PhD, I came back to Armenia because I was writing on post-Soviet Armenia, the processes by which political elites formed, etc. Maybe there's a place where I can place my book. After I did my PhD, I got an offer from Routledge Publishers and turned my PhD into a book. It's called Post-Soviet Armenia. I think you can find it on Amazon and on Routledge and Taylor and Francis publishers' websites. And, I was here and was very proactive with different non-governmental organizations pushing for more green policies. And at some point I realized that, civil society does have a strong function in terms of pushing the needle, but private sector is what in many respects drives policies, even in developing countries like Armenia. So after some thought, we decided, my sister and I and our husbands were like, let's start a business that's very focused on social entrepreneurship. And we designed a business that was very sustainable from the perspective of, the entire value chain, from the coffee that we source to the composting of coffee grains, to our staff that we hired. And at the time, it coincided also with the war in Syria. And we had a very big wave of Syrian Armenian migrants. And we tapped into that amazing human potential. And most of our staff actually were Syrian Armenians. So we put together this value system on which we built our business. And it was fascinating. I look back retrospectively, there were so many naysayers that in Armenia's context, it wouldn't work because we're still a developing country. The issue of, earning your daily bread is always paramount, and issues related to sustainability and taking care of your staff are always on the back burner. And we proved the opposite. From being the first coffee shops in Armenia that were non-smoking, pet-friendly, employed refugees, and composted and ensured that our sustainability value chains are to the utmost possible what the infrastructure allowed us at the time, including no plastic policy. We proved a lot of naysayers wrong. And it was also thanks to the ecosystem that began to form around our business And fast forward 5 years, we opened two more branches. And in 2017, we successfully divested, as by then I already had three children. I published a book, and my sister and her husband left to pursue their further studies and careers abroad. And we felt it was the right time at the height of the business to divest it, which we did successfully. And now working for an international financial institution, having done a stint also in the government, I feel like that was one of the most enriching periods in my professional and personal life. It's, running your own business, particularly focused on social sustainability, social environmental sustainability. It teaches you a lot of things that classrooms won't teach, books won't teach. It gives you incredible amount and volume of also emotional intelligence and business acumen. So yeah, after we divested, I focused on my book, and after that, I was offered a position in the government. I worked for the government of Armenia for about 3 years, almost 3 years. I served as Deputy Minister of Environment. Serendipitously, although being formally taught in political science and international relations and diplomacy, I gradually became one of the prominent voices and faces of sustainability agendas. And I wasn't surprised when the offer came from the government to co-lead the Ministry of Environment, which I did with so much gratitude. I feel like, serving your government is one of the biggest and most important callings any professional can ever have. And having had the background in diplomatic studies and international relations, I was in charge of negotiating and advancing the agendas of multiple environmental conventions that Armenia is a signatory to. After I left the government, I worked for a number of institutions, development institutions, and then I finally landed here at the World Bank. And I work on a number of countries, including also Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine. So I don't know how many minutes I've been giving you a little bit of a rundown, but you gave me the avenue to walk through, so I did.
No, seriously, that was awesome. I'm so impressed. You've done so many cool things and taken so many risks. Like, it's so inspiring. I love it. So cool. So, you're talking a lot about like social entrepreneurship and sustainable entrepreneurship. I feel like climate change is one of the biggest issues that we have right now in the world. I used to be an environmental journalist actually before I got here, and I really love learning about anything that has to do with the environment. So, how do you bring this big, overwhelming topic of climate change and make it more digestible for your customers and, make it accessible to other people as a social entrepreneur?
Thank you. That's a very important question, one that I constantly put on my table because, after all, I am a senior climate change specialist now, and this is the daily dose that I process, trying to ensure, as you said, that information on climate change is not too overwhelming. It's digestible and relatable, right? Because there are so many other things on the plates of our client countries in terms of crises related to, what Armenia has gone through recently, a major war, then ethnic cleansing of Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, there was a lot that consecutive administrations had to deal with here, and how do we keep climate change on the agenda of the governments? For countries like Armenia, it's a low-hanging fruit from the perspective that Armenia is not a fossil fuel intensive country, nor it's a fossil fuel producing country. Its fossil fuel dependency, in fact, is energy security, if not national security issue. So divesting away from dependency on fossil fuels is not only a climate mitigation agenda, it's also a national security and energy independence agenda. So from that perspective, we don't need to do a lot of convincing. But from the perspective of where do we find the resources to help Armenia to transition to renewables, how do we mobilize these resources and most optimally invest in the country? This is where most of the talk and discussion with our client countries happens, and specifically with Armenia. It's a lot more difficult to work in countries that are fossil fuel intensive, whose economies are built on carbon, and talking about decarbonization when the economic growth and wealth of those nations depends on how much they extract is a completely different ball game. Let me put it this way. So yeah, I have the easier end of the deal in terms of working with countries that have this in their agenda as a priority in terms of energy independence and national security. And the war in Ukraine also has highlighted the significance of political baggage that comes with dependence on fossil fuels. And this has facilitated our narrative a lot more. By our, I mean those people who work on climate. So we work very, I would say, analytically and institutionally from the perspective of delivering to clients and also development partners why this agenda is important. So in many respects, yes, the World Bank as an international financial institution is an MDB, multilateral development bank. But at the same time, and many seem to not be aware that the World Bank is also a knowledge bank. And this has evolved over time within the institution because we constantly were challenged to ensure that every dollar invested in different countries is invested in the most sound manner possible. So over time, the bank also became a knowledge producing institution. And most recently, we started working on these flagship reports that are called country climate and development reports, where we align projections for development with the climate projections, both on the mitigation and adaptation agenda, and engage with clients from that angle. That is, what is the trajectory of the development, what is needed for it, and how climate will impact it, both the agenda of adaptation, how do we prepare the country to adapt to warming of the planet, which is happening, and how do we help the country with its mitigation commitments under the UNFCCC Convention and the Paris Agreement. We've recently authored one for Armenia, and I always tell from my students to my clients and to our colleagues in development world, please do refer to these seminal pieces. They're very helpful in understanding how countries can, and they can, and we can globally as community, we can. The money is there, the resources are there. We can make the energy revolution to decarbonize. What is missing is the political will to do that. And this is where, my formal education in political science, IR, often helps to engage with every proponent, if you will. I also teach climate change at the American University of Armenia. So from the naysayers, which students are very much, because they look at numbers and are like, well, since the Paris Agreement was signed, the emissions continue to rise. So what are we doing? All right, to governments who are also hesitant, particularly those that are dependent on fossil fuels. So yeah, it's a heavy loaded question, and unfortunately a heavy loaded answer, because there are many dimensions to the climate agenda. But what is important to stay the course is knowing that the resources are there, the financial resources are there globally, the natural resources are there globally on a planetary scale to transition to a more decarbonized future. What is needed is the political will of governments globally to commit. And this is something that we're unfortunately seeing a retraction from, hopefully temporarily.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes total sense. Like the government plays a huge part in how much impact we have. So, but it's great that there's people like you who are working towards, a better future, not just in Armenia, but all around the world. So, as a woman entrepreneur, I feel like it can be harder sometimes to get your foot in the door, have people take you seriously. What's some advice that you have for other women who are entrepreneurs, but maybe they're facing some more roadblocks in their way?
Thank you. And I think for women, whether they're in private sector entrepreneurs or whether they're in government or whether they're in the corporate world, unfortunately, we still see glass ceilings and walls. And as we evolve as society, and our institutions constantly push for more gender responsiveness, gender inclusivity, things tend to move a lot slower than we would wish for. Let me give you an example from my career, my professional career, being in a position of deputy minister. So I digress a little bit from entrepreneurship, largely because in political circles, the presence of men is more prominent, although at higher corporate level, it's almost the same, right? When we talk about private sector. So I found myself being an absolute minority when I was deputy minister in my 30s in a quite conservative country that has traditionally had governance institutions staffed at high political and decision-making level exclusively by men to be leading, co-leading in ministry. And at some point in my early days of the high public office, I started getting very frustrated simply because women have traditionally been looked at as those who service the processes of decision making, but they weren't considered decision makers themselves. And there's a lot of nuances that goes into this, right? From how you dress, from how you present yourself, from where you're seated in the room. You know, especially in public office where protocol is king when you're going and meeting other delegations. So I remember one day walking into the office of my minister and telling him, I don't understand why when we walk into the room with you and my colleagues, everybody greets them with a handshake and I'm ignored. And I remember he told me, he's like, you have to make yourself open to giving a handshake. I was like, are you telling me that I need to demand a handshake? He said, pretty much, yes. And you know that conversation transitioned into me putting together a lecture and a talk. I've given that in a number of universities at different platforms. It's called Demanding a Handshake. And I realized that unless you make yourself present, aware in the position of a decision maker, and it can start as simple as extending a handshake yourself rather than waiting for somebody to extend it to you, is where you start breaking or putting that little crack into that glass wall that seems to be separating you from the world of decision makers that tends to be mostly masculine, whether in different cultures or in different corporate worlds or governance and diplomatic circles. So that taught me a lot. I started to be more proactive about positioning myself as a female decision maker. And I think this message transcends also into private sector. Women need to be a lot more proactive in networking, need to be a lot more proactive walking into the room. And that starts with a handshake, that starts with engagement, that starts with giving out your business cards, being present, being part of the clubs. There are a lot more male clubs in every part of the world, in every culture, than female clubs, right? So this female solidarity needs to be also driven by more proactive women so that they also have their afternoon clubs or lunch clubs or tea clubs, whatever, where they can align forces and help each other out. And yeah, that experience certainly taught me a lot, where unfortunately, despite all the efforts that we do now, from speaking from the position of a developing organization that is mandated towards development, there's a lot of gender inclusivity and gender responsiveness as a requirement for lending, let's say, for financing. We still face a lot of obstacles and bottlenecks. And to overcome that, certainly make yourself present and demand a handshake.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. It's so true. You need to, put yourself out there and show up determined and demanding a handshake. I love it. I'm gonna totally take that with me now after this and think like that when I enter these big rooms. So this podcast is aimed towards college students. So one question that I've been asking everybody is if you could talk to yourself when you were just starting your career, when you were in college, what's like a piece of advice that you would give to yourself?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I would say enjoy life. Really take time to enjoy the freedom you have as a student, as a learner. Take time to visit museums, go to performances, because once you are out there in 9 to 5 with family and commitments, the time to educate yourself beyond the formal education, the time to explore the world beyond what you get to explore as a student in your formal academic studies becomes very, very narrow. So I definitely would say take time to do a lot of extracurriculars, because there is a whole life school that you get to acquire through these processes as well. going with friends to a theater performance, traveling, taking a road trip. That's a school of its own that I feel young students need to commit themselves to and enjoy life as well. And the second advice I would give to my younger self is stop being worried. Everything's going to be okay. It seems like when we're young, we always question, am I taking the right career choice? Am I not taking the right career choice? How is the exam results going to impact my possibility of getting a scholarship? We worry too much, and that puts us into this spiral of anxiety that then doesn't allow us to enjoy those incredible formative years that most of the students and your listeners are. So control that anxiety if you're experiencing it. And most of young people, because they're pursuing education, they're probably taking on student debt. I'm still paying off my student loan and it's okay. Don't worry about it. So yeah, relax. Don't let the anxiety take over you. It's very important to focus on the beautiful period in life that you're in and on expanding your learning horizons beyond the classroom, beyond the formal education. Explore the world while you have the freedom to do that. That's certainly the advice I would give to my younger self.
I love that. That honestly, that hit home for me too, because I feel like I definitely always worry. I feel like other college students, it's always so scary about the future, but to hear somebody like you say that, who's so successful, definitely makes me feel a lot better. And I'm sure a lot of other people are gonna really like that too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Irina, for joining us today. I am so inspired by the work that you've done and the journey and all the risks that you've taken. Yeah, you're awesome.
Thank you so much. And once again, thanks so much for having me on. I love the questions that you gave, and it always is refreshing to do this little journey back and retrospectively looking back. It makes you being more thankful for what you have today. Thank you, Madison.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And then to everyone listening at home, thank you so much for tuning in to the Bridging Minds podcast. I hope that you were inspired just as much as I was and believe in yourself a little bit more in your power to make a difference in the community. Stay tuned for more stories from innovators and entrepreneurs like Irina, who are building bridges between education, politics, climate, and social impact. And until next time, I'm Madison Miller. Keep creating, keep questioning, and keep pushing forward.